Hi, my name is Kevin Thomas, W1DED. Today I have with me a very special guest from Italy, Claudio Capelli, I4LEC. Claudio was recommended to me by Andrea IK4VET, who's actually been a great source of European hams that I can talk to. When I started communicating with Claudio, there was a couple things that I really paid a lot of attention to, and I want to read a couple of these lines. Quote, "We tend to give for granted that more elements, longer booms, higher antennas are always better, but it is not. Everything is relative to a specific location and should be tailored accordingly." The other thing that popped out in the email exchange was this background that Claudio's had with contesting, but he set contesting aside over a decade ago, and he moved his interest toward other areas, including SDR platforms, rig performance and measurements, peculiar antenna designs, antenna height based upon given topography, short boom antennas versus long boom antennas. So I think this is going to be a really interesting conversation, and I really appreciate that Claudio has taken time to do this long distance interview today. Claudio, thanks for joining me.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Kevin. Hello and good morning.
So let's begin with your ham radio background. I'm always intrigued to know how people got their start. When did you get licensed, and why did you get licensed?
Well, I started at a very early age, Kevin, basically when I was a teenager, going at the high school, first grade high school. So I was 14 years of age at that time. And a classmate was actually living within the same building of an amateur radio. So one day he took me to his place and he introduced me to his amateur radio friends. So then we went to the basement, and there was an old radio, a Geloso radio, an Italian radio at that time that he was actually using. And what struck me was the fact that he allowed me to tune in and listen to Japanese. So basically we were into this basement and I was listening to Japanese stations. So that really sparked my interest into this hobby. And since then, I started immediately to apply for the license. Therefore, I went through the exam. I passed the theory, the CW. And so I basically had to wait until 16 to get my amateur radio license, Kevin.
So what did that look like back then when you were 16? I presume you had the call sign you have today, I4LEC. But were you operating contests back then, or what was your operating style? CW, phone?
It was, yes, it was the same. It is still the same call sign. And actually, we started to operate before getting the call sign. Myself and I4 Victor Echo Quebec, which you might recall from the WRTCs last year, as he was one of the organizers. His name is also Claudio, and he owns the station at Italy Radio 4 X-Ray, which now has changed to Italy Papa 4 X-Ray, actually. So he owns that station, and him and I, actually, we were going to his uncle without call signs, both of us using his call sign, his uncle's call sign, up on a hill and doing contesting without even having an amateur radio license. Obviously, these weren't the main contest. We were basically entering the All Asian contest, this kind of contest. But anyway, we started contesting at the age of 15, 16 without call sign. So is how everything started. Claudio and I basically at his uncle's QTH.
Well, I appreciate hearing that story. And this is the second time this has come up in a week. I thought it was a big secret that I was operating with my dad's call sign when I was a kid. And now I've heard a couple people that were operating the same way, but I was WA1YOA while I was in high school, while I was waiting for my novice license to show up, until I got found out by a local ham who recognized that my CW sounded different than my dad's CW. So again, I can totally relate. So you got into contesting right away. One of the things that interests me, Claudio, before we start getting into the technical part of your ham radio experience, you were a pretty serious contester for a lot of years, correct?
Correct. That's for at least 30, 35 years. And I forgot to answer to your question before. It was basically a sideband. I went through the CW test, but then I basically really get into sideband contest. And I only recently started to get to build up my CW because losing the interest, I thought that maybe trying to build up my CW once again would have been something to keep me attached to the hobby.
I'm guessing that all those things on your walls might be contest related. Is that right?
They are, yes. There are a lot of awards and plaques that are coming from mainly CQ Worldwide, Sideband, ARRL, WPX. They're all sideband. There are also actually a couple of awards that belongs to Andrea, IK4VET, who you mentioned it earlier, actually because he happened to spend sometimes here at my QTH and using the station and doing CW from my station. Because basically this station was built in order to do contesting, and even looking at this QTH was meant for contesting as it's located right up on a hilltop. It's just a few kilometers inland from Italy Radio 4 X-ray QTH, which is exactly at the same height. Our elevation is roughly 1,400 feet above sea level, both of us, and therefore knowing exactly the performances that you can obtain from that QTH, where I was also participating in the multi-single category. So I also did a lot of contesting from that contest station. So then I realized that I was looking for a place that was having a similar characteristics in terms of orography, etc. So that's why I looked for a place nearby, and here I am.
So tell me more about that. That really intrigues me. So you found this location that would be a great contesting location. What did you do with it? What do you have there for towers and antennas and equipment?
Well, a single tower, which is a freestanding tower, which I actually took down from an ex-power line tower. So it didn't cost me really much, just the weight of iron, basically, and the crane to take it up to my place. So then we put it up the tower with the help of the other guys, the other friends from the team. And once we got the tower up, basically, the first antenna that I managed to get it up was a simple tri-bander, a TH5, which was right up on the top on the mast, roughly at 80 feet from the nearest ground. So that's what I started with. So basically with the TH5.
And how did that change over the years? Obviously, you were contesting from there for a long time, and most people I've talked to are always tinkering. They're always adding to, replacing. How did your station evolve over time?
Well, as everyone else, you really want to improve your station. So once I entered a lot of contesting on which I figured out that 15 meters, for some reason, was the best band. I don't know why. I was having an extra length of opening in the evening when the band was closing down. So basically 15 always proven to be the best band. What you see behind, it's a lot of contesting either on 10, 15, 8 CQ Worldwide. Basically there is a first European on the CQ Worldwide sideband as well. So pretty good. I was performing pretty good with a single, tri-bander, a TH5 at a limited amount of power as well. So then, as everyone else, I wanted to improve, which is quite normal. So then I thought, why don't you get rid of the tri-bander and instead get a couple of long boom monobander, long john, high gain on those days, a monobander, which I did. I put up a 105 CA, 155 CA right on top. And then I thought with these two antennas, I could perform much better. But it wasn't the case. So that's really what struck me. I wasn't able to get the same results as I was having it with the TH5. So I struggled to figure out why that was the case, Kevin.
Tell me more about that, because I think what you're leading into is your interest now. I mean, you start off with contesting. You're an accomplished contester. Then you upgrade your antennas and find that that's not working out quite well for you. And it reminds me of another line you put in your note. The idea is to do more with less. So was this the trigger for you that maybe you could do more with less? And what did that look like?
Well, more with less is basically a style of life. That's my way of being in every circumstances. So it's not really just related to amateur radio. It's really basically the way I used to be. But aside from that, what I've done, the next step was to put up a small 4-element CB for 10 meters antenna on top of my house, which was about 30 feet below the height of the upper, monobander. And while working into the West Coast, I realized that the signals on the upper monobander were something like 10 to 15 dB lower than on the 4 CB, 4-element CB antennas, which had probably a couple of dB less of intrinsic gain. So then I once again scratched my head. How could that be possible? And obviously then I started to thought about elevation, takeoff angles, and on that regard, I started to use HFTA as a tool in order to figure out what would have been the outcome in terms of takeoff angles related to a different height based on my orography.
So, Claudio, I've seen some of the presentations you've sent to me, some of the documentation you've sent, and I've also looked at your QRZ page. You clearly have a very strong technical understanding of the hobby and of antennas and equipment. Is that something you've been self-taught to know, or does this somehow line up with your professional career?
No, self-taught actually. So that's something which I built up throughout all of these years, getting interested in the hobby and trying to figure out different things in the hobby as well. So basically, no. I mean, my background is a technical background, but not up to the point on which I could figure out these things. So then it was error and try. I tried and make errors. So then I replaced several times the antenna. So then after I figured out that the 4-element CB antenna was actually performing better at that height, what I've done is I took down the monobanders and replaced them with an TH5. So then I went back to the previous setup on which later on I added a second TH5. So then basically I ended up with a couple of TH5 and everything turned out to be perfectly as it was when I started basically.
So, Claudio, the conversation about antennas is probably the most prevalent conversation that I hear, both in my interviews, but also just talking to other hams. And I know this is very generalized, but what would be your best advice to somebody? Would it be to get an HFTA analysis and then start experimenting? Is that the place to begin?
Well, according to my experience, yes, that would be a good starting point. You would forgive me, my dog, which is behind and is impatient as she wants to go out for her, afternoon walk, but she will be waiting. So then, yes, that would be a good starting point. HFT8, it's certainly a good starting point, especially if you do live not on a flat ground. If you're on a flat ground, it's pretty much straightforward. You know what to expect. You know what would it be the main elevation angle, and therefore based on the height of the antenna. So that would be pretty much straightforward. But once you live up on a hill or you're in a place on which the terrain behind you is not regular, therefore I would definitely suggest to use that tool before thinking at which height you should put the antenna, because you might find out that too high is actually too high. So then in my case is 80 feet, and actually 80 feet has been proven at my QTH to be too high as per the notes that I sent you. So that's why, we normally tend to say, well, put it as high as possible, put as many elements as you can. Well, actually, it's not going to work this way. Yes, it might be working that way in case you're on a flat terrain, then obviously you tend to optimize, your main lobe with the maximum possible gain. But once you're up on a hill, it's not really that way. It's not really that simple. You have to figure out that at that height or on that elevation, you will have to figure out several other lobes which will be showing up on your spectrum, actually. Therefore, you have to take into consideration also the attenuation which can happen to the secondary lobes once these lobes are the ones that are actually working in your case. At my location, my antenna at the maximum height at 80 feet, those have a 2 degrees takeoff. 2 degrees is not always the optimum height, absolutely. As we well know, if every one of us has went through the W2 PV book, knows that the optimum height on the path US to Europe and vice versa, East US and Europe, is basically around 9 degrees with a range of 3 to 17 degrees. So that is actually the range that you're looking at. So if you do have a main lobe, as per my case, at 2 degrees, that will work perfectly at the band closing when it gets dark, and you will be the only one hearing those people that are coming through for the remaining 30, 40 minutes. But then other than that, right in the middle of the opening, the angle will be much higher. Therefore, your 2 degrees, if you only rely on that lobe, your signal will be definitely weaker than the people down to the valley.
So, Claudio, I am fascinated by the fact that you were an accomplished contester. You decided to leave contesting behind. Your technical knowledge, as you've just impressed us all with, has only gotten even stronger. What was the disconnect? I mean, I listened to you, and I would be tempted to get on a weekend contest to try all that stuff out. And it was also intrigued me that you actually mentioned in your email that you remember exactly the time when you decided that contesting wasn't for you, and it was during the 2010 phone WPX contest, which it sounds like you operated from the US at NQ4I. Tell me, I guess I've got a lot of questions in that statement, but one question is, what happened? What shifted with the 2010 WPX contest? And aren't you tempted to get back on your station and operate the ARRL DX just to try out all this firepower that you've developed?
The short answer is no, I'm not tempted. I will be tempted in case I will have to find some intriguing way to enter a contest. For instance, after that contest, which I will come back later, actually I did enter a contest with a really small software-defined radio, a Flex 1500. So that was something new. You know, I was able actually to enter a QRP mode with 5 watts using a 5 watts radio, as I do believe that if you are enter a QRP, you shouldn't use a 200 watts and crank it down, to 5 watts. That to me is not entering a QRP contest. If you do QRP, you do use a radio that gives you a QRP power. So in my case, it was a 5 watts Flex 1500. So that was something that I wanted to try, that brought something new, because after 30 years, I knew exactly what to expect, on which direction, who would have worked at that time, how the band would have behaved. So therefore, I was really looking for something new. And something new in that case was to operate at 5 watts with a 5 watts radio. And that was nice, But that was really the only contest I did participate after the experience at NQ4I, not because it wasn't a good experience. Actually, it was my birthday. I took a business flight to Atlanta. So on my own, I went to Rick's place. I met a lot of interesting people there, well-known contester at its station. It was enjoyable staying along with them and playing with them, running the contest with them, figure out how the contest would have been from US, which wasn't actually my first contest off of US. I actually did participate at the station of N4 Zulu Charlie, which passed away unfortunately long ago. But one of the contests that I did from US, the first one actually was at Rogers Place. So this at Rick's Place was actually the second one. So it was a great experience. I enjoyed it immensely. But then when I came back, for some reason, something has switched to me. And since then, except the QRP contest, I really quit doing contesting for good.
That's a great answer, Claudio. I totally understand. It's just ready to move on and do something different, something more intriguing. So what is your style of operating now? Do you get on to do DX, or how do you operate now?
Yes, I do get on to do DX, especially on CW, trying to work expedition on CW, as my CW is still quite poor. It's not up to the task on being able to do conversation. So therefore, I can really basically pass the reports during either a contest or during an expedition. So that's what basically I do, try to fill up as many countries as I can on CW, which I found it, an interest, new things a new way of doing radio, learning a new language, as CW is basically really a language, try to figure out in my mind and trying to keep with the, with the age, keep up with the age as well, as we not really too young anymore. So we were teenagers when we started, but nowadays we obviously not anymore.
So Claudio, I'm very aware of your dog wanting to go for his walk, so I'll wrap this up soon. But I do want to, before I let you go, I want to get into your work with rig performance and measurement. Tell me about that. What have you done in that area?
Well, in that area, I was actually brought to that area by a local M who passed away, who actually was doing a lot of measurements in terms of IMDs on receivers. So basically, one day I took him my 775 DSP. So we opened it up and he worked out a roofing filter. So basically, he did the tailor a roofing filter for that radio. So until we were able actually to obtain a better measurements in terms of IMD. So close, nearby 2 kilohertz, signals IMD. So that is basically the way I've been brought to that point. So then I actually, after that, I got myself into that measurements and I did some of these measurements by myself. And lately I worked out a table, which actually is available on QRZ, which actually combined all of the Sherwood measurements in one figure of merit, which is called OEE, Overall Equipment Effectiveness. So basically, with a single number, which is expressed in percentage, you can actually determine the quality of that radio, taking into consideration not just the close space signal IMD of third order, but basically all of the other parameters. So you combined all of these parameters and you come up with a single figure of merit, which is available on QRZ.
I have seen that on QRZ, and I would recommend to anybody that they check it out. It's very extensive, very well researched. Were there any surprises that came out of that for you when you actually saw the numerical results?
Well, not really, actually, because the top radios, the top IMD performances on close spacing actually turned out to be pretty much at the top as well on the overall numbers. So basically, really the top radios can be a couple of, step above or below, but it doesn't matter. Once you're in that range, you can really figure out which one is the best. One thing which you can appreciate is that software-defined radio has an Achilles heel, which is the single signal blocking. Actually, you will see that the blocking of software-defined radio, direct sampling radios, this radio does have a blocking limit, which is in a range of 126 dBs. Whereas if you look at the top Super 8 radio, those radios can go up to 150, even 155. So there is huge difference in that regard. But overall, then if you look up at all numbers, then you'll see that aside from that, which is not really a big point, because even 126 dB of blocking, it's a lot of dBs. I have my nearby neighbor at 5 kilometers, IR4X, or IP4X nowadays, their signal is a 6 dB over 9. Therefore, I couldn't be able to operate. But it's not the case. I can easily operate, even though when they're on the air, I can operate with my software-defined radio. So that's not a big point as far as I'm concerned, even though that number is definitely much lower than the Super 8 radio.
So as I said, I would recommend to any listener to go to Claudio's QRZ page and check out some of this data. It's fascinating. Claudio, what's the coming year look like for you? What's on your ham radio schedule?
This is a good question, as I'm struggling to answer, Kevin, because nowadays I still have to find out what might be, my next year's involvement in this hobby, as now I'm having difficulties in finding a new interest which could energize me and getting me into the radio as once was.
Well, I hope to come back and ask you that question later and see what the answer has become. You're clearly an engaged ham radio operator and somebody that doesn't let any moss grow under your feet. So I appreciate, Claudio, you joining me today. It's been a great conversation. I've been talking to Claudio I4LEC. He's joined me from Italy. Thank you.
Thank you too, Kevin. Good morning, and thanks a lot for having me. Bye-bye.